The Queen glanced up, frowning. Mr. Tibbs looked down at his toes and his lips moved in silent prayer. That was only one titchy little bite, the BFG said. If you have any more of this delunctuous grubble in your cupboard, Magister. Tibbs, the Queen said, showing true regal hospitality. Fetch the gentleman another dozen fried eggs. And a dozen sausages. Mr. Tibbs swam out of the room, muttering unspeakable words to himself and wiping his brow with a white handkerchief. The BFG lifted one huge jug and took a swallow. Ouch, he cried, blowing a mouthful. Please, what is this horrible swigspill I was drinking, Magister? It's coffee, the Queen told him, freshly roasted. It's filthsome, the BFG cried out. Where is the frobscottle? The what? The Queen asked. Delumptious frizzy frobscottle, the BFG answered. Everyone must be drinking frobscottle with breakfast, Magister. That is, then we can all be whiz-scoppling happily together afterwards. What does he mean, the Queen said, frowning at Sophie. What is whibs-popping? Sophie kept a very straight face. BFG, she said, there is no frobscottle here and whiz-popping is strictly forbidden. What? Cried the BFG. No frobscottle, no whiz-popping, no gumptuous music, no boom, 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 boom? Absolutely not, Sophie told him firmly. If he wants to sing, please don't stop him, the Queen said. He doesn't want to sing, Sophie said. He wants to make music, the Queen went on. Shall I send for a violin? No, Your Majesty, Sophie said. He's only joking. A little sly smile crossed the BFG's face. Listen, he said, peering down at Sophie. If they isn't having any frobscottle here in the palace, I can still go whiz-popping perfectly well without it if I is trying hard enough. No, cried Sophie. Don't. You're not going to. I beg you. Music is very good for the digestion, the Queen said. When I was up in Scotland, they play the bagpipes outside the window while I'm eating. Do play something. I has Her Majesty's permission? Cried the BFG. And all at once he let fly out with a whiz-popper that sounded as though a bomb had exploded in the room. The Queen jumped. Whoopee! Shouted the BFG. That is better than bagpipes, isn't it, Magister? It took the Queen a few seconds to get over the shock. I prefer the bagpipes, she said, but she shouldn't stop herself smiling. During the next 20 minutes, a whole relay of footmen were kept busy hurrying to and fro from the kitchen, carrying out third helpings and fourth helpings and fifth helpings of fried eggs and sausages for the ravenous and delighted BFG. When the BFG had consumed his 72nd fried egg, Mr. Tibbs sidled up to the Queen. He bent low from the waist and whispered in her ear, Chef sends his apologies, but we're out of eggs. What's wrong with the hens? The Queen said. Nothing's wrong with the hens, Your Majesty. Mr. Tibbs whispered. Then tell them to lay more, the Queen said. She looked up at the BFG. Have some toast and marmalade while you're waiting, she said to him. The toast is finished, Mr. Tibbs whispered, and Chef says there is no more bread. Tell him to bake more, the Queen said. While all this was going on, Sophie had been telling the Queen everything, absolutely everything, about her visit to the giant country. The Queen listened, appalled. When Sophie had finished, the Queen looked up at the BFG, who was sitting high above her. He was now eating a sponge cake. Big friendly giant, she said. Last night those man-eating brutes came to England. Can you remember where they went the night before? The BFG put a whole round sponge cake in his mouth and chewed it slowly and thought about this question. Yes, Magister, he said. I do think I was remembering where they was going that night before last. They was galloping off to Sweden for the sweet and sour taste. Fetch me a telephone, the Queen commanded. Mr. Tibbs placed the instrument on the table. The Queen lifted the receiver. Get me the King of Sweden, the BFG, she said. Good morning, the Queen said. Is everything all right in Sweden? Everything is terrible, the King of Sweden answered. There is panic in the capital. 2 nights ago, 26 of my loyal subjects disappeared. The whole country is in a panic. Your 26 loyal subjects were all eaten by giants, the Queen said. Apparently they like the taste of Swedes. Why do they like the taste of Swedes? The King asked. Because the Swedes of Sweden have a sweet and sour taste. So says the BFG, the Queen said. I don't know what you're talking about, the King said, growing testy. It's hardly a joking matter when one's loyal subjects are being eaten like popcorn. They've eaten mine as well, the Queen said. Who is they, for heaven's sake? The King asked. Giants, the Queen said. Look here, the king said. Are you feeling all right? It's been a rough morning, the queen said. First I had a horrid nightmare, then the maid dropped my breakfast, and now I've got a giant on the patio. You need a doctor, quick, cried the king. I'll be all right, the queen said. I must go now. Thanks for your help. She replaced the receiver. Your BFG is right, the queen said to Sophie. Those 9 man-eating brutes did go to Sweden. It's horrible, Sophie said. Please stop them, your majesty. I'd like to make one more check before I call out the troops. The queen said. Once more, she looked up at the BFG. He was eating donuts now, popping them into his mouth 10 at a time, like peas. Think hard, BFG, she said. Where did those horrid giants say they were galloping off to 3 nights ago? The BFG had to think long and hard. Ho, ho, cried at last. I was remembering. Where? The queen said. One was off to Baghdad. As I was galloping past my cave, Flesh Lumpeater was waving his arms and shouting at me. I was off to Baghdad, and I was going to Baghdad, and Mum, and every one of their 10 children as well. Once more, the queen lifted the receiver. Give me Lord Mayor of Baghdad. If they don't have a Lord Mayor, give me the next best thing. In 5 seconds, a voice was on the line. Here's the Sultan of Baghdad speaking, the voice said. Listen, Sultan, the queen said. Did anything unpleasant happen in your city 3 nights ago? Every night unpleasant things are happening in Baghdad. We are chopping people's heads off like they are chopping parsley. I've never chopped parsley in my life, the queen said. I want to know if you had anyone disappear recently in Baghdad. Only my uncle, Caliph Harun al-Rashid, the Sultan said. He disappeared from his bed 3 nights ago, together with his wife and children. There you is, cried the BFG with those wonderful ears. Enable him to hear what the Sultan was saying when the queen was on the telephone. Flesh Lumpeater did that one. He went off to Baghdad and Mum and all the little kiddles. The queen replaced the receiver. That proves it, she said, looking up at the BFG. Your story is apparently quite true. Summon the head of the army and the head of the Air Force immediately.